Now I'm going to introduce our third speaker who doesn't know this, but he actually was the great inspiration behind this Band of Brothers conference, because we were all sitting around at a committee meeting at the De Vere Society saying to one another, isn't it absolutely brilliant, Ian Johnson's book, Renaissance Man, The World of Thomas Watson. And it was out of that that the idea of this Band of Brothers conference happened. So I'm very grateful to him for that. The book is actually going to be one of the prizes that are going to be drawn out of the hat later on. And it's going to be a signed copy, not this one that's been thoroughly eaten up by my avaricious eyes. Ian, for those of you who don't know him, he's written many reviews and many articles. He's worked for a long time for the BBC. He trained as a historian. And as I say, he writes a brilliant sentence and is a very fine man. Over to you. Thank you, Ian Johnson.
Well, thank you, Alexander, for that almost embarrassingly kind introduction. I'd like to start with a little teaser. In 1635, Thomas Heywood published his Hierarchy of the Blessed Angels. Now, it's a very large book, 2 inches deep, 622 pages. About a third of the way through, Heywood lists 10 Latin poet-playwrights who were noted imitators or adapters of other people's works. They are Latin ones. He then compares them with 15 Elizabethan and Jacobean poet-playwrights, listing each with a short and familiar first name. So, for example, Robert Greene is Rob Greene, Christopher Marlowe, Kit Marlowe, that is Tom Kidd, Jack Fletcher, Ben Jonson, etc. Heywood seems to be saying that not one of these poets of his recent generation could achieve his name in full because he was a collaborator with or a front man for a nobleman. And I suppose I hardly need add that all 10 had likely connections with the Earl of Oxford circle. This is how Heywood wrote about Thomas Watson. Tom Watson, though he wrote able to make Apollo's self to dote upon his muse, for all that he could strive, yet never could to his full name arrive. Tom Watson, though he wrote able to make Apollo's self to dote upon his muse, for all that he could strive, yet never could to his full name arrive. So Tom Watson could never achieve his full name of Thomas because, try as he might, for all that he could strive, he still owed a debt to another writer. But Heywood is also praising Watson, saying that despite his indebtedness, Watson was by no means an empty wordsmith. Watson's muse, says Heywood, was so fine, so compelling that even Apollo doted upon it. And, you know, we're talking about Apollo here, the sun god of music, poetry, art, medicine, light, and knowledge. It's quite a compliment. And I should add a tentative comment here that some argue that the name Apollo at this time sometimes personifies the Earl of Oxford. So all that's just an introduction. It's an enigma, and I'd like to put it to one side. Thomas Watson was born in 1555, in May, actually, around about May, in the parish of St. Olave in London. His father was a member of the powerful company of drapers, extremely rich, and owner of at least 2 London houses. Thomas, however, could hardly have known his mother and father, for they died when he was 4, at which time, with his elder brother William, he was shipped off to Oxfordshire to his uncle Thomas Lee, his mother's brother. Lee was also a draper with connections to the Cecil family. He was wealthy and well-read, and the ideal guardian and mentor for his nephew. The Lee family had Catholic sympathies. In 1567, Thomas Watson was sent to board at Winchester College. Now, Catholicism pervaded that college. It was the last of the old established schools to buckle to the religious changes. Now, like the majority of Winchester's pupils, Watson went on to New College, Oxford, but he didn't take a degree there, and he took ship instead for the continent of Europe. It was the early 1570s. He was 15, and his decision may have been decided in the light that the commissioners for religion were hard at work, sweeping out of Oxford everyone that, to quote Anthony Wood, smelt of popery or were popish affected, suspending, imprisoning, or expelling them. It's likely that Watson headed for the University of Padua. Edward de Vere's first tutor, Sir Thomas Smith, had trained there, and at Padua, Watson may have encountered de Vere himself, for Oxford was journeying in Europe between 1575 and 1576, stopping at Padua once and Venice, which was just 25 miles away, twice. In 1576, Watson left Italy for the English College of Douai in Flanders, and that's remembered as a seminary for the training of English priests. By that year, he was a holder of a bachelor's degree, probably from Padua, perhaps from Douai. But now, the stench of death drifted across the Low Countries. When on the 6th of August, 1576, a local rioter at the gates of Douai cried, "Were not all the Englishmen's throats cut last night?" Watson, with a few others, left for England the very next day. Now, this is very important. It's important to stress that Watson straddled two literary camps, supposedly fiercely opposed. Oxford's group, who met, as we know, mainly at Jasper's Folly, the Earl's Gate on Bishopsgate, where Euphuism held the sway, and the Walsingham-Sidney and Wilton House coterie. The enmity between the two circles has been mentioned, but it may be exaggerated. Both were influenced by the Frenchman Ronsard, and quite possibly Euphuism lost its drive actually in the mid-1580s when the thrill of literary rivalries was sapped by the death of Sidney. Watson believed he owed a debt to Walsingham, which he declared in his glowing elegy Medibus on Walsingham's death in 1590. I speculate that his loyalty dates back to the 1570s. Walsingham himself had been a well-regarded student at Padua, so perhaps he lubricated Watson's entry to the university. I also think it possible that in 1572, when Watson's uncle Thomas Lee died, and Watson's funds largely dried up for the time being, he may have looked for support from Walsingham, then in Paris as ambassador, to dangle as one small thread on Walsingham's intelligence web. Years later, in 1581, Walsingham returned to Paris with Watson among his entourage, employed to carry messages back to London. Into this context must be placed Watson's close friendship with Sir Thomas Walsingham's first cousin, Thomas Walsingham, and touching on that, his friendship with Christopher Marlowe. All three, Walsingham, Thomas Walsingham, Christopher Marlowe, and Thomas Watson, were close friends. When Watson returned from the continent to London in 1579, it's likely he set about making alliances with literary colleagues, probably at the Inns of Court. He lodged first in Westminster, where he shared a house with Edward and Anne Burnell, and he seems to have encouraged the delusions of Anne Burnell. Now, Anne Burnell was a butcher's daughter from East Cheap who had worked herself into a pitch of excitement when a witch assured her that marks on her body proved she was a child of Philip II of Spain. A dangerous delusion because it could suggest she was a daughter of Queen Mary and a claimant to the throne. Burnell alleged that her belief was encouraged by a gentleman that was said to be very well learned. That gentleman was Thomas Watson. When a few years later the case finally became before the Privy Council, Watson denied anything incriminating. Burnell herself refused to give up her claim, and in 1592, after Watson's death, was tied to a cart and whipped through the streets of London. Now, Burnell's husband, Edward, was a Catholic subversive from a not insignificant family. His sister was a favourite of the royal bedchamber, married to the grandson of Anthony Babington, and Edward himself was probably a Mr. Burnell imprisoned after the Babington plot in 1586. So you might think that Watson was acting as agent provocateur for Mr. Secretary Walsingham. Now, at this time, London's population was increasing rapidly, but relatively it was still small, and family interrelationships were common. And intriguingly, the Burnell affair sheds light on a couple of the band of brothers. Look again at Edward Burnell's family, and we discovered he was also the stepbrother of the poet and translator Barnaby Googe. Googe was a royal ward under the protection of Sir William Cecil, and must have been acquainted with Cecil's son-in-law, the Earl of Oxford, another former ward, and of course, with Thomas Watson too. And here's another case. 5 days after poor deluded Anne Burnell was whipped through the streets of London in December 1592, a ballad about the affair sold hot off the press in those same streets. Its publisher was Edward White, whose catalogue includes works attributed to Oxford and William Shakespeare. White was well placed to glean inside information from Watson himself about the Burnell affair, because White was married to Sarah Lodge. Sarah was the half-sister of the writer Thomas Lodge, another member of the band of brothers. And Lodge's mother, Lady Anne, had brought up Watson's sister Maudlin on the death of her parents. In other words, in short, Thomas Watson's sister was also Thomas Lodge's little half-sister. Watson's first shining moment arrived with the publication of his The Hekatompathia, or Passionate Century of Love. The work was dedicated to Oxford, the year was 1582, and by now Watson had definitely thrown in his lot with the Earl. The Hekatompathia is a hodgepodge of love poems, which Watson called sonnets. All were 18 lines, and if you date by some 9 years, all subsequent true 14-line sonnets, including those by Philip Sidney. Now this work, the Hekatompathia, is suffused with De Vere's influence. Let's start with the title page, which is decorated with 4 woodcuts. Into the design of one of these blocks, I incorporated 2 Cayley greyhounds. Now, the Cayley greyhound, to quote J.P. Brooke Little, a former Clemenceau King of Arms, is a rare monster. It has the head of a wildcat, frond-like horns, tufted body and tail, rather like a lion's, and 4 limbs, which end in claws. It was the badge of the Vere family. The Cayley greyhound was taken up in the arms of the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Earls of Oxford. The 17th Earl ceased using the arms. Now, the woodcut in the Hekatompathia is as identical as makes no difference to one repeated 4 times in the first folio of William Shakespeare, published 41 years later in 1623. The first folio was sponsored by the brother Earls Pembroke and Montgomery, and the wife of the Earl of Montgomery was Susan de Vere, the daughter of the 17th Earl of Oxford. Turn the book's page and we discover Watson's dedication to the Earl of Oxford, in which he narrates the story of Apelles, the Greek painter regarded as the greatest of antiquity's artists. One of Apelles' most outstanding paintings depicted Alexander the Great holding a thunderbolt. Watson compares Oxford with Alexander the Great. Now that image reminds one of Gabriel Harvey's comparison of Oxford to Pallas Athena, the goddess of truth. Thine eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear. And as you will know probably, a hereditary title of De Vere before he succeeded as Earl of Oxford was Lord Bolbec, and the Bolbec crest shows a lion brandishing a broken spear. The Hekatompathia also contains a series of puffs sung by friends and protégés of the Earl of Oxford, including John Lilly, George Buck, and George Peele. Each of the 100 sonnets is headed with a prose introduction offering a background to the verse which follows. The only word to describe the erudition of these prefaces is breathtaking. They cite and quote from 32 myths and acknowledge or quote from 25 Italian, French, and Italian sources. Commentators have puzzled over the identity of their author ever since Edward Arber in 1870 queried whether they may have been written by the Earl of Oxford. Others have suggested Chapman or Lilly. I believe the probability, excuse me, is that they are composed by Watson himself. Watson was highly educated in classical and European thought. At his old school of Winchester, the head was a leading classicist, Christopher Johnson. For me, the matter is settled by Sonnet 40 of the Hekatompathia, in which he writes about the death of Petrarch's Laura, concluding a preface by saying, under which name also the author in this sonnet specifieth her whom he lately loved. Throughout the 1580s, Watson was mixing with intellectuals excited by advancements in science, medicine, cosmography, theology, philosophy, architecture and art, literature and music. Historians have grouped these intellectuals into schools, but the groups overlapped, and I would suggest that like-minded friends don't necessarily form a school. There is a so-called School of Night. Prominent in it were the polymath and astrologer John Dee and his friend, the mathematician Thomas Harriot. Harriot was employed in turn by Sir Walter Raleigh and Henry Percy, known as the Wizard Earl of Northumberland. Marlowe was associated with these men, and it would be surprising if his friend Watson did not share a place at Raleigh's dining table, or especially at Percy's, since Watson dedicated at least 2 of his works to the Earl. Present too may have been the Earl of Oxford, another of these affiliates, friend to Raleigh and believer in astrology. And Watson would have deserved a place at the table. The scientists Eric Altshuler and William Johnson have drawn attention to the preface of his sonnet 31 in Hekatompathia, where Watson describes what he calls galaxia, a white way, he says, a white way or milky circle in the heavens. In other words, the Milky Way. And this was advanced stuff preceding Galileo's description by some 30 years. We have a glimpse here of Watson's reputation as an intellectual with a knowledge of science and the occult, or, as was said of him, a wise man in St. Helens that could tell strange things. And this is apparent too from his book on the skill of memory training, Compendium Memoriam Localis. Now, there was another group dubbed the University Wits. The title seems to be dreamt up by the Victorian scholar George Saintsbury, who suggested a small circle of Lilly, Marlowe, Green, Peel, Lodge, Nash, and probably Kidd. But it should have included Watson. Since Sainsbury, scholars' imaginations have run riot. They've expanded the group to around 40 or so poets, playwrights, pamphleteers, and wits. Feasibly, Sainsbury's wits and Oxford's disciples are the self-same group. All except Marlowe and Kidd are known or believed to be associates of Oxford, and I think Alexander will be explaining later this, the probability is that Marlowe and Kidd were too. Music was also basking in a golden age for which Watson was perfectly suited. As a lad at Winchester School, he had been taught by Thomas Stemp, a skilled musician in charge of the cathedral choristers. Now we know that Watson had a beautiful singing voice. He recalls in his Elegy Mellibus, published in 1590, how 9 years earlier, his tunes often pleased Thomas Walsingham's ear, when he and Thomas Walsingham, his sweet friend, sat beside the Seine in Paris. Now, Watson was collaborating with William Byrd, one of the greatest of English composers, described even by his contemporaries as the father of British music. Bird knew Edward de Vere, whose verses he set to music, and who signed over to him the lease for a manor in Essex. Bird held the royal patent to printed music, and in 1589 collaborated with Watson on a vocal broadside for 6 voices entitled A Gratification unto Master John Case. The pamphlet was a novelty, poetry designed to be set to music. It was followed the following year by the historically important The First Set of Italian Madrigals Englished. Watson was actively involving himself in what was to become recognized as a glory of English music. And to quote his biographer, he was, and is, the only well-known literary man associated in any direct way with the English madrigal. Soon, Watson was moving in higher circles. At a time when every writer in London sought a commission, it is probable that Watson had received the most envied of all, a royal entertainment. In August 1591, Elizabeth commenced her most ostentatious progress for years, concluding a journey over southern England in mid-September with a 4-day entertainment at Elvertham in Hampshire, the seat of Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford. As the Queen approached the house to arrive for supper, she was met by a poet, dressed in green and wearing a laurel wreath, who fell to his knees, declaiming in Latin a panegyric to the Queen, while 6 virgins performed behind him, attired in gowns of taffeta sarcenet. It is possible that the poet who bestowed this welcome was Thomas Watson. In his paper on the entertainment, Harry H. Boyle argues that much of the poetry for the occasion was by Thomas Watson and the writer Nicholas Breton, under the direction of George Buck. Now, there's a common denominator between Watson, Breton, Buck, and Edward Seymour, at whose house the entertainment took place. All were familiar with Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Seymour and his family were friends of Oxford. Breton was probably a member of his literary circle, as of course was Watson too. As for Buck, he was not only an ally of Watson and a member of the Earl's literary circle, we know he was an intense admirer of Oxford. So perhaps we may suggest that the event could have been organised by the Earl of Oxford or by Buck in collaboration with the Earl. We have no idea what de Vere was up to between early July to early December in 1591, a period which covers the whole of the entertainment. So the possibility of his involvement cannot be ruled out. And it's worth bearing in mind too, that earlier progresses had been supervised by men in Oxford employ. George Gascoigne and Thomas Churchyard supervised the entertainment at Kenilworth in 1575, and Churchyard alone supervised the entertainment at Norwich in 1578. Watson's cooperation with the Elvertham entertainment took place against the backdrop of an increasingly complicated personal life. In December 1588, Oxford had sold Fisher's Folly to William Cornwallis. Watson stayed on as a tutor to Cornwallis's son. By now, he was married and living in the liberty of Norton Feldgate, near to the theatres and a short walk from Fisher's Folly. Towards 1592, he became increasingly trapped in a scandal involving Cornwallis's eldest daughter and a musician living in the Cornwallis home. The musician's name was Thomas Swift, and he was the brother of Watson's wife, Anne, and another brother, Hugh Swift, a lawyer, was also implicated. As the storm clouds gathered, 2 of the scandal's leading players died, it was said, of the plague. The death of Thomas Watson, Gent, was registered at St. Bartholomew the Less in West Smithfield on 26th of September 1592. 10 days later, the same register entered the name of his brother-in-law, the lawyer Hugh Swift. Watson was just 37 years old. After his death, his friends were lavish in their tributes. His reputation was high, and his works profoundly influenced Elizabethan poetry. Watson was admired as a classicist, linguist, poet, dramatist, intellectual, and musician. He was also a government agent, a Catholic, a wit, a joker, a loyal friend, and an associate of many in high places, including the Earl of Oxford.